Good afternoon. Our subject today is Cezanne, an artist that I confess I had a difficult time liking and understanding. I think Cezanne's a challenging artist to come to terms with, but we'll do the best we can here. An artist certainly who had a great impact on the later history of art. Um, Cezanne lived between 1839 and 1906, and he was from the town of Aix, A-I-X, in the south of France, located about 15 miles north of Marseille. So it's near the coast, but not on the coast, more in the hills and mountains north of Marseille. He had a good classical education there. Among his few childhood friends was Émile Zola. I think they're very close in age. They may be identical in age. Zola, of course, would become a major novelist and writer, a critic in among within 19th century French culture. He departed for Paris in 1859, so that would have been Cezanne was about 20 at the time. In the time Cezanne would follow him. But in the meantime, Cezanne entered law school. Now I should explain that his father had become quite wealthy as a manufacturer of hats, so wealthy that he became part owner of a bank. And Cezanne, the father had the usual lofty parental aspirations for his son, wanted Cezanne to go to law school. Not everybody became a lawyer after going to law school, but it was kind of an entree card to all kind of jobs. You might work in a customs office, you might become a judge, you might do a bunch of different things. So reluctantly, Cezanne enrolled in law school in Aix to satisfy his father, but at the same time, he began taking drawing lessons. He showed little interest in law, and eventually convinced his father to allow him to go to Paris. This was in 1861, so Cezanne would have been about 22 years of age at the time, to embark upon a career as an artist. Of course, with years of training to begin. And so when Cezanne went to Paris, he first attended the Académie Suisse, or Swiss Academy, where a model was available to draw, to paint, without charge. And there he met the future Impressionists, Monet, Sisley, Renoir, Basile. So these were, Cezanne was not particularly close to them, but these were relationships that that would be a benefit to him in future years. He took the entrance exam to enter the École des Beaux-Arts and failed the exam. So his start was quite rocky. Let me go to some images here. And I want to show you here an example of his early work. Let's see, this is his uncle Dominique. And the painting dates from about 1865 to 67. Cezanne signed very few works. So we have little precise documentation of the date of works. If the work was exhibited somewhere, that's helpful, although we exhibited rather little. So I'll be giving you dates that are approximations, circa this, or perhaps a span of years over which the work may have been painted. This early work of his uncle Dominique is part of a series, and his uncle put on various kinds of clothing, garments, hats in modeling for these works. you can see the work is broadly painted, the face kind of roughed in. And in fact, much of this is done with a palette knife. Um, Courbet is a strong early influence. Courbet was also an extensive user of the palette knife. And um, the result is a very heavily pigmented surface that gives the figure a sense of material solidity. And this is something we're going to see kind of off and on in Cezanne's work throughout his career. Beginning in the 1860s, Cezanne submitted works to the Salon virtually every year, 64, 65, 66, every year, and was always refused. And I'll tell you now that only once, and I believe this was 1879, when a friend was on the jury, and all jurors had the right to select one work that they wanted to be included in the exhibition. And it didn't matter what other jurors said, that one work was automatically accepted. That artist, juror, Guillaume was his name, chose a work by Cezanne as a friend, as a favor to his friend, and that was the only year that a single work of Cezanne's was exhibited at the Salon. It was not commented on, nothing much came of it, nothing came of it really. So his exhibition history there is virtually nil. Among his early works from the late 1860s are a strange sequence of works that depict violent activity between human figures. This one's called The Murder. There's one called The Autopsy. There's another, The Rape. And here I show you that work. They show the influence of Delacroix in the rich colors. Delacroix was a strong early influence. Cezanne studied his works in Paris, where they were on view. But you'll notice the figures are quite unnaturalistic in their proportions and the way their body parts fit together. So the works were not they're not based on study of a living model, but rather drawn out of Cezanne's imagination. The subjects, of course, spring from his imagination, and so they really prompt questions about his psychological state. They're sort of romantic fantasies, but of a particular violent and sexual kind. It has been there's a lot of speculation about the kind of thoughts and urges that Cezanne may have repressed, not only at this stage in his life, but later as well. They come out in the choice of some rather strange subjects, or the odd portrayal of certain subjects. The tensions that one sees existing between figures. It was around this time that Cezanne met Hortense Piquet, a young model, and began a relationship with her that would last through his life, although later on they weren't particularly close. She bore him a son in 1872, and Cezanne hid her and the son as well for about 17 years from his family. So when I speak of repression, these are the kind of things that he was doing or thinking that were then hidden from others, hidden from family, and that give evidence of unusual and fraught relationships with other human beings. An early work that I think is quite impressive is the one on the screen entitled The Black Clock. This dates from 1870. And I think this Well, this gives us an example of a subject that would remain important in Cezanne's work throughout his career, that is still life. He is perhaps drawing on Dutch 17th century examples in his painting of this, and yet it's painted in a way that is really quite distinctively his own and would bear out in his later works as well. So as subject matter, we've got a clock that oddly has no hands. It's a clock face without hands. One description of this that I've encountered is that it's tombstone-like, a very solid, dark, weighty object. There's a vase in the middle. Here we have a shell with knotty protuberances on one side, a cup and saucer, a lemon partly hidden, and a tablecloth. And you notice that the tablecloth looks as substantial, as weighty as, well, the shell certainly. And this is the result of his exaggerating the light and dark contrast between the shaded areas of the cloth and those that are high lit, and exaggerating certain contours here, for example. I think the contrast between the whites and blacks which dominate the image and a few color accents in the shell and the lemon are really effective. The tablecloth creases line up with verticals above and a few horizontals to create a kind of a solid geometric structure against which the organic forms, the lemon, the shell, stand out in contrast. So this is a subject that Cezanne would come back to later on. We'll see some further examples of still life painting in a few minutes. Here, another fairly early work. This depicts Cezanne's father reading in the newspaper L'Avènement, and it dates from 1868, 1870. We're going to see here, and really even in even more exaggerated ways in later works, that Cezanne is little or not at all interested in personality in painting a figure, but rather in the formal properties of such an image. So, for example, the slope of the shoulders, and even the shape of the cap is coordinated with the high back of the armchair. The coloring of the newspaper is harmonized with the coloring of the chair, and perhaps the pants as well. You notice that the shadows are very strong. Again, there is a solid geometric structure of horizontals and verticals against which the figure plays. And the newspaper at a diagonal creates an element of contrast. Much of this, again, painted with a palette knife. In the early 70s, Cezanne met Pissarro, Camille Pissarro, the Impressionist painter. Having trouble advancing here, so bear with me, please. To work with Pissarro more closely, Cezanne moved out of Paris and took up residences at Pontoise and then later Auvers. Pissarro was a helpful influence, drew Cezanne away from the romantic fantasies, the scenes of sex and violence from just a few years before, and engaged him in the painting of landscape, and introduced him to the Impressionist challenges of rendering forms in light and atmosphere. And this was this seemed to have helped Cezanne to focus and to sort of calm down, be more disciplined as a painter. Um, he worked en plein air, painting out of doors, and painted subjects and compositions in clear colors, like the other Impressionists, but portrayed them in more dense, solid forms, without the flickering, luminous effects that were being explored by artists like Monet and Renoir at the time. So this is a painting that I've shown you before because it was exhibited at the First Impressionist exhibition. It's called The House of the Hanged Man. You notice that rather than the little flecks of color that Monet and to some extent Renoir used, with Cezanne you've got dabs of color that may have been applied, at least in some cases, with a palette knife. And they're built up in a more dense surface so that the buildings portrayed here have a material substance that is alien to the works of Monet. The House of the Hanged Man, the title suggests that someone was hung or hung himself at one of these houses. I suppose the one here whose door we see. The composition is interesting in that we're looking for a narrow gap down into the village, and the space of near and far is compressed. It's the smaller size of the buildings in the distance to give us some sense of depth across the painting. This was one of the works exhibited at the First Impressionist exhibition, along with this. Still having trouble moving forward. Along with this view of Auvers, again painted in lighter colors than before. It looks more. It would seem to have less detail, less sense of light flickering on these forms, and rather more solid geometric forms than Monet's work at this time. This is called View of Auvers from 1873. And at the First Impressionist exhibition, finally, a modern Olympia was depicted. And I've shown you this before as well. This strange variation on Manet's Olympia. It's hard to know with what attitude Cezanne depicted this. Was it a joke? Was it sarcasm? Is he going back to the sex-crazed fantasies of his earlier work? The figure on the couch looks a good bit like Cezanne, that is balding and bearded, looking up at well, what is this? Is this a real figure present? Is it a vision? Is it purely a figment of the figure's imagination, with a drapery that may have previously covered the figure being pulled away by a black serving woman? Of course, the nude figure and a black serving woman are both present in Manet's Olympia. We have a little dog down here, and the table, rather oddly painted with its top tilted toward us such that it's a wonder anything stays on it. Likewise, the hat, the man's hat that is perched on the edge of the couch in a way that seems precarious. So, a very, very odd painting. Cezanne exhibited once before with the Impressionists in the third exhibition, which took place in 1877. He showed 16 works at the time to critical ridicule. Cezanne was singled out among the painters, especially ridiculed by critics, and he resolved then never to again participate in the Impressionist exhibitions, and in fact he didn't. He participated in only two, 1874 and 1877. Cezanne's Impressionist period is dated from about 1872, when he began working with Pissarro, to about 1882. And we're looking at a work from that period, which is called Les Stocks, which dates from 1874. Les Stocks was a village close to the sea, not far from Aix and Marseille. During the Franco-Prussian War, when Basile went into the army and was killed, Degas, Manet also served. Monet went to London, as did Pissarro. And Cezanne took his wife, and they both hid out in Lestock and waited the war out. This painting done there is akin to Impressionism in its light colors, its bright, really bright colors. One of the most impressionist of Cezanne's paintings. For him, the brushwork is fairly light. What's interesting is the way the sea is flattened out into a shape that has little depth to it. We're looking at a steep rise of ground and buildings in the foreground. That too seems very flat. And so this is a kind of foreshadowing of a flattening and formalizing of the landscape that will appear even more frequently in Cezanne's later works. In portraits such as this, we see Cezanne's mature style emerging. This is the collector Victor Choquet. Choquet was a collector of Renoir, and Renoir introduced Cezanne to him. This portrait was made in 1877. You can see what I mean by, we get a little sense of the personality of the character of Choquet. He's simply shown here as a form occupying this chair and arranged so that much of his body conforms to the grid of floraline and paneling on the back wall and picture frame that are seen there. Notice that the chair back aligns with the picture frames, his upper leg with the floor, his lower legs, this one forms a vertical, it conforms to the gridded architectural setting. He looks at us frontally, and parts of his body, particularly the lips, you can see repeat colors and shapes that are seen in the background. Another example of this appears here in Cezanne's painting of Madame sous Cezanne. This would be Hortense in a red armchair in the painting. This also dates from 1877. Again, we get little sense of her, but quite a beautiful arrangement of colors, with emphasis on the curved chair back and the way it repeats the shape of her shoulders and the shape of her dress and the striations, the stripe pattern in the dress, quite beautifully rendered in a range of green and blue colors, bringing a kind of geometric quality to the painting. One just rarely sees in portraits. I've got a bunch of still lifes to show you. The dates on these are obscure. They date from a range of 1880 to 1890 and early 90s. Cezanne may have worked on some of them over a period of time. But again, primarily we just don't know from any exhibition history or dating on the works when they were painted with any precision. This became then one of Cezanne's most important subjects, a favorite subject of his, where his models might get tired after a while. There is evidence that they posed for portraits like the ones I just showed you over and over and over again for long periods of time. With a still life subject, he could arrange fruit and silverware, plateware, and they could stay there indefinitely. Although we know of cases where the fruit would rot before he finished painting it. So here we have a work that probably was never finished. You'll notice that there's bare canvas showing in places. And yet, while not a finished image, this would I think qualify as a complete image, as Baudelaire distinguished between those terms. And what we're looking at is a group of apples arranged on a what looks like a chest. And I say a chest because this is the hasp that would secure the chest, although it projects straight out toward us in a way that's somewhat, you cast a shadow you can see against the front of the chest. So here's the front of the chest, the top of the chest. I'm not sure what to make of this shape over here. It does repeat something of the pattern on the wallpaper in the background. And then there's a plate over here with a couple of biscuits. For the most part, the apples exemplify something that Cezanne would do throughout his career, and that is model forms, model the three-dimensionality of forms in color rather than light and shadow. Now there is a little bit of shadow in places, but you'll notice that here, for example, the color of the apple changes from reds and oranges to more yellows at the top. And so that modeling suggests the roundness of the form. But in addition, the apple has a, I'm going to enlarge this a bit. The apple has an outline and shading around it, which tends to flatten it out. So that these two perceptions on the part of the viewer, the flatness, the apparent flatness of the apple in some respects, the three-dimensionality of the apple accomplished mainly with your modeling, those two responses create a kind of a tension, which in our viewing experience, which for many viewers makes the image particularly interesting, fascinating to study and to ponder. In the background, you can see he has suggested a pattern which is nowhere repeated, a vegetal pattern that relates to the apples. And we've got a plate over here cut off with a couple of biscuits. Now, one thing we see in these still lifes, let me show you a few more, is a shifting point of view. I'm having trouble opening an image up. Bear with me, please. Okay, we'll just go to the next image. This is entitled Still Life with Apples, although we've got many other things here, including a ginger jar and a vase and a wine bottle. And you'll notice that if you look at the tops of these containers, that they seem to be seen from different angles. To some extent, this can be attributed to the plate, for example, to their positioning. The plate seems to be tipped up and supported by the tablecloth. Well, particularly in the case of the vase, as our view of the vase differs from the view of the opening at its top, which seems twisted toward us. And I think this is done in order to coordinate with the oval shapes of the ginger jar next to it, perhaps the plate as well. So Cezanne is interested in imposing a kind of logic of form, coordinating shapes with one another, and this involves deviating from naturalism, emphasizing certain things with giving them greater gravity, like the tablecloth, which we saw earlier, and happens here as well. And I compare this to Monet's painting of the still life from about the same time period. I want to go back if I can and put the works on together. I'll say about this while we're waiting, that we're looking here at a work that simply does not contain disjunctions between shapes, but it appears that it was all seen from a single point of view. You'll notice that the brushwork is quite different. Monet's approach, of course, would always be more optically oriented, trying to record the, um, the perceptions, the sensations that he experiences. So let's just move ahead here and look at a couple other still lifes. All right, there we've got one to look at. We're looking at still life with fruit dish. Looks like the same chest was used. In fact, you can see certain containers, that ginger jar, in this case the chest, with the hasp sticking out here toward us directly, used over and over and over again. The wallpaper in the background looks like they have the same pattern we saw earlier. In this case, it's a fruit dish, which is, I suppose, is the most prominent motif. You notice that its parts don't seem to coordinate with one another in a completely naturalistic way. It appears that the top of the drinking glass repeats the larger form of the top of the fruit dish. The curve here of the base repeats the curve of the apple, the curve of the tablecloth. Here we see that frequent motif, traditional motif in still life painting of the knife that angles off of the edge of the table toward us and repeats the diagonal forms that appear elsewhere in the image. Color is quite bright here, fairly strong contrast of light and dark. We can also see here Cezanne's parallel brushstrokes. You can see it across the fruit dish, here the tablecloth, in the background, really many places. And this has been labeled his constructive brushstroke, which doesn't so much define we can see in the apple here, which notices green on the bottom and changes color as one looks across the surface, which doesn't so much define the form or describe the form as impose a kind of organizational motif on it that coordinates one object with another throughout the painting. Back to a couple landscapes. This is the Gulf of Marseille seen from Lestock, painted in 1883, 1885, so a more mature, a more developed landscape than the earlier view of the sea from Lestock that we saw. The diminishing size of buildings suggests depth. The overlapping of forms, particularly in the foreground. But you'll notice that each broad area of the painting, the sea, the mountains, the sky, each one of these areas looks flat in and of itself. So there is a tension, as we've seen in other of his paintings, between the perception of what's represented as a illusionistically deep space, that's most apparent in the bottom, with the emphasis on the flat surface of the painting that is particularly evident in the upper part of the work. We can see again his constructive brushstroke evident in the roofs that define planes, geometric planes. You can see it in the fields over here as well. Or here another landscape from about that time, one of about 60 that Cezanne painted of Mont Saint-Victoire. So this was the prominent mountain that is located, 5 miles or so from Aix. It's visible from many different points of view. And this was probably Cezanne's favorite landscape motif. He painted it over and over and over again. And in this view, from about 1885 to 87, we're looking threw it around a pine tree toward the mountain. The pine tree frames the profile of the mountain and the ridge near it. Um, in painting landscapes like this, Cezanne is quite selective in what he emphasizes, what he omits, what he includes. This is an aqueduct in the distance. Um, but you'll notice that it kind of disappears over here. Uh, the foreground is no more clearly defined than the background. So again, um, there's a kind of tension between flatness and three-dimensionality. And we see here, additionally, something that Cezanne would do a great deal, and that is play off warm colors against cool colors. So right through the middle of the painting, you see the warm colors of oranges played against, contrasted with the cool colors that create a kind of rhythm. Now, what Cezanne said he was aiming at doing here was doing Poussin all over again, but through nature. And what this expression indicates is wanting to confront the landscape directly. These were at least partly en plein air paintings, but to impose on the landscape a formal structure that gives solidity and substance and harmony to the forms that are represented within the frame of the painting. So I want to remind you of what the works of Poussin look like, if I could get there. I brought a couple examples. All right, this is Et in Arcadia Ego, which dates from about 1639 to 1640. We're going back in time a couple hundred years. And what it depicts is a group of shepherds discovering the sarcophagus and tracing their fingers over the inscription and realizing that it contains the body of a dead person. They're discovering death, the reality of death, the inevitability of death. And the female figure who clasps her hand on one of the shepherd's shoulders is thought to be a personification of death, somberly looking down toward the ground. Well, notice how she aligns with the tree in the background. And the trees that we see here with their canopy of leaves, 1, 2, 3, 4, echoes the number of figures and even the arrangement of figures. So there's a harmony here between the human activity and the natural landscape that gives the painting a firm, thoroughgoing structure. One other example of this is the Poussin painting Landscape a Calm. This is a pendant to Landscape a Storm. You can imagine that shows us a turbulent landscape. Here in Landscape a Calm, we're looking at, of course, a classical landscape, an idealized landscape that may have been based on some sketches done outdoors, but is very much a studio painting with trees strategically placed to frame the view into the distance, and focal points at different locations in the distance that define a foreground where a shepherd or a goat herd and his goats appear, and the middle ground where there is a cow herd or a shepherd, I'm not sure which, I guess a cow herd, as well as buildings over here, and then distant building, and then finally a rugged mountain mass. Well, that mountain mass echoes the rather idealized, highly geometricized village in front of it, but it's also echoed by the clouds, the shape of the clouds. You can see here the contour of the mountains, how it echoes the clouds. So a very beautiful landscape that expresses these ideals of harmony and unity. And so it's something like this, but from this very different, a very personal point of view that Cezanne tried to bring to his painting of the landscape. And in his late works, one sees two kinds of landscapes. That is, very closed landscapes, forest scenes. This is the Bemus Quarry, which is located in the vicinity of X. It dates from around 1900. Um, the depiction of it really flattens out the quarry and renders its shapes as a kind of intricate puzzle of warm, irregular shapes set against the cool color of the pine trees, and or more open panoramic landscapes uh, with Mont Saint-Victoire frequently as your subject. So let me get there this way. And this is a late view of Mont Saint-Victoire, which dates from 1902 to 1904. I confess one of my favorite paintings in the history of art. You can see that this is a good bit freer from the Bemus Quarry landscape that we just saw, and perhaps any other landscape by Cezanne. The foreground, no more clearly painted in the background. Cezanne is very much emphasized what he wanted to, what he wished to. He has included certain landscape forms, particularly houses here in the foreground, rather selectively, and perhaps probably omitted other things. You'll notice that there's a lot of patchwork in the way buildings, but also tree masses are represented with parallel brushstroke hatchings. You can see here, maybe most obviously the mountain. And a stacking up of lines which are just, they deviate just a bit from horizontality. So here we have that here. You see it again, this may be the aqueduct. You see it over here. The line of the horizon is more or less pure horizontal, with lines in the sky even and lines in the mountains deviating along diagonals. The colors that one sees really anywhere contain, for the mountain, for example, primarily blues and grays, but there are also some greens and there are also some warmer shades that echo other parts of the painting. And down below, we see the blue of the mountain and the sky echoed in the buildings and in the landscape foliage in front of the buildings. So this view of the landscape is very much Cezanne's own. It's unique to him. It's a kind of formal design that he's imposed on the landscape that seeks to harmonize one form with another according to his own perceptions. Cezanne's late depictions of the human figure are, if anything, more static. We're looking at Woman with a Coffee Pot from 1890-92. And I believe that these are mostly modeled not by family members, not by his wife, but rather by employees. When Cezanne's father died, he was financially well off, didn't have to worry about money, and had servants and gardeners, and he often used them as models. So the woman here, I'm guessing, is most likely a domestic worker. Notice that she is posed in a way that is ambiguously kind of in between standing and sitting. And the same is true here of the way the table is depicted. It's hard to tell what's the top of the table, what's the front of the table. Right in here, we ought to see a division between the two, but that seems to be eliminated. Cezanne shows the table then more as a colored surface that rises vertically. The garment of the woman has a shaded area, shaded line right down the middle. It is slightly off vertical, but which aligns with the paneling behind her. So we have a rhythm of verticals across the canvas. These disjunctions from a perfectly vertical grid, something he would do quite intentionally. It brings instability, an intentional instability to the painting. By the way, this vertical is paralleled by the coffee spoon, which stands upright in the cup, and the pot itself. Um, the warm and cool colors here, again, oppose one another and echo one another. Warm coloring in the tablecloth and the background um, paneling, but it contains cool colors, bits of blue here and there that echo the dress. You can see a bit of blue here in the tablecloth as well. Notice the hands, which are modeled, but then also surrounded by shadow, which flattens them out. So the flatness and three-dimensionality stand in tension with one another. And another late figural subject, this is card players, dates from around 1890, where these players face each other very statically. Um, there would seem to be some intentional distortion of figural proportions, a small head, long body, long arms, many of the same features we've seen in brushstroke, in color opposition, in slightly deviant vertical lines, contrasted with the rounded shapes of the figures. Cezanne's late period is generally regarded as dating from 1895 to 1906, when he died. In November of 1895, Cezanne received his first one-man show at the Gallery of Ambroise Vollard. 150 works were exhibited. And while it was not a great financial success, many artists, many of his former Impressionist co-exhibitors were very impressed with the style that he had developed, working primarily in isolation. Cezanne's last great project was to paint bathers, and this is called the Great Bathers or the Large Bathers. It's the final variant of this subject, dating from 1904 to 1906. Now again, he did not have figures modeling for the painting. He's drawn on memory and his own preferences in organizing the figures and in drawing them, and so they seem to deviate quite extensively from realism or naturalism. Notice this figure here, this standing figure, who is positioned in a way and proportioned in a way to echo the line of the trees, which frame this view into the distance. This is a large painting, an ambitious effort, and it's the outcome of many studies and smaller works of individual and groups of figures. And here we see Cezanne in his elder years posing in front of the painting. He was befriended by a number of young artists, and Neil Bernard was one of them, who saw in him the accomplishments of a great master, and so visited him, discussed art with him, and sought to learn what they could from his works. Though in fact Cezanne had no immediate imitators, no students, and yet his art provided lessons for really generations of painters to follow. And I show you here in conclusion then an exhibition view. This was the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, at which time Cezanne's Great Bathers came from Philadelphia and was exhibited alongside Gauguin's late masterpiece, Where to Become From Who Are We and Where Are We Going? So these paintings were made almost simultaneously, right around 1900, and in their different ways, they provided inspiration and lessons in the making of art that um, later generations of artists would draw on. Um, both artists very influential, but in different ways. Cezanne, influential as an artist who imposed a structure, imposed a formal order on the landscape, one of his own devising, which deviated significantly from naturalism.